I talk about this in the book. A part of that was just that we bring a lot from our birth families, and my parents were real worrywarts. And I think I came into this parenting thing as a worrywart, and also someone who really doubted my abilities as a mother. We didn't get a diagnosis till Michael was 11, and his early school years were a lot of trips to the principal's office when he was in like first grade or kindergarten. I can't remember which, but so by the time he was diagnosed, I had kind of felt like I was not doing a great job as a mother.
Welcome to The Uptick, brought to you by the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, empowering children and adults through education, advocacy, and research by sharing the stories and experiences relevant to the TS community. Welcome back to The Uptick. I am here with Michele Turk. Michele has worked as a journalist for 3 decades, covering parenting, health, and education. She lives in Connecticut and recently wrote a book, which will be released on June 4th of this year. The book is called What Makes Him Tic, a Memoir of Parenting a Child with Tourette Syndrome. Michele, it's great to have you on the call here.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. I've actually been a listener for a couple of months now.
Oh, glad to hear that. We're always excited to have listeners that are also taking part in being on this podcast. I'm curious to hear the story of what really inspired you to put together this book.
Back in 2011, Michael, same name, he had mild motor tics for years, but it really escalated and he was diagnosed with coprolalia. And it really blindsided me and my husband and, of course, my son and daughter. And as a journalist, I just started scribbling notes and writing in my journal in real time because it was just kind of hard to believe what was happening. It's a really bizarre diagnosis at first. So then even though I'm trained as a journalist, I took a memoir writing and essay writing class about 8 months later. And that's really when I started thinking, okay, there might be more to this here. And also in the meantime, I had been trying to read everything I could about Tourette syndrome. And I realized that there wasn't a book quite like this out there. So it's really the book that I wanted to read back when my son was first diagnosed. And then what that book ended up being is it's a blend of the memoir, but I also sprinkle in lots of research and reporting, interviews with Tourette experts and so forth. And the goal really has always been to help other people, whether their child has Tourette syndrome or some other tic disorder, or they're neurodivergent in some way, to help them feel less alone and help parents get through what can be a very challenging time. That's how it all came about.
One of the things you talk a lot about in the book is the media misrepresentations of Tourette. You mentioned the Simpsons episode back in the 90s. That was one of the earlier examples of the media sensationalizing it, playing up coprolalia, things like that. And it's interesting because at that time when Michael was diagnosed, I think you said he was about 11 and going through seeing
Right.
doctors, going all the testing that we do for this before diagnosis happens. How did the media's portrayal of Tourette impact this diagnosis, or how you thought about it? Did you say, he can't have Tourette, he doesn't swear? How did those two come together?
Yeah, good question. So I'm trying to think back about what I knew about Tourette syndrome at the time. Early on, he did have mild motor tics like eye blinking and facial grimaces. We consulted the pediatrician. We consulted a pediatric neurologist twice who told us that it's common in boys. He'll likely outgrow it. And this is information that a lot of parents, I learned, and as well, are told. I would ask specifically, is it Tourette syndrome? Could it be Tourette syndrome? I didn't know a whole lot about it. I had a professor in journalism school who had Tourette syndrome, who was, very high functioning and inspirational, but I didn't know. I knew what most people knew from the media, and those representations are, as you said, it's often misrepresented. Only about 10% of people with Tourette syndrome have what's called coprolalia, which is the cursing, shouting obscenities and other inappropriate words. And so that actually is what happened when he was 11. He did start shouting obscenities. And when I did reach out for all sorts of help, I learned, as I said, that it is rare. Michael's now 25 years old, and I think a lot has changed. There is definitely still a stigma surrounding Tourette syndrome, and there are still so many myths and misperceptions out there, no
Mhm.
question. But I think that things like your podcast and what the Tourette Association of America is doing, and places like the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome, they've done a tremendous job educating the public and the medical community about Tourette syndrome and tic disorders. And I think that as a result, kids are more likely to get a diagnosis earlier, but also people are learning more about it. It doesn't hurt that people like Billie Eilish and Louis Capaldi have Tourette syndrome and are speaking publicly about it. That will move the needle.
Once he got that diagnosis, going through school, having any kind of condition, but especially things like tics, there's really unique challenges there, and also the co-occurring conditions. What did you find over the years really moved the needle and benefited Michael?
As a parent, the worst thing to see is to watch your child suffer. And early on, Michael, he would call himself a freak. I mean, it was heartbreaking. So we did immediately, I immediately started looking for help. We went to the local neurologist. I called the Yale Child Study Center, where he eventually ended up being treated by Dr. Robert King, who's wonderful. But I was told it would be a while before he could get in. So I started trying all sorts of things. There's a chapter in the book called Throwing Spaghetti at the Wall, because all the different things I tried, from acupuncture to chiropractic to an elimination diet. Michael did eventually get on a course of medications, and he was on them through his sophomore year in high school. So he's been off of medications for a decade now. So, but it was trial and error. One of the challenges for me was putting my trust in these doctors, but it was comforting to know that the Yale Child Study Center and Dr. King were renowned Tourette experts. But also, so in addition to the prescription medicine, there are definitely other, what I would say non-traditional sort of therapies that helped Michael. And so a big one was music. We discovered early on a road trip to Vermont that when Michael drummed or sang, or I guess it was drumming in the car, that he stopped ticking. I mean, it was like magic. And he was ticking a lot at that point. I mean, we're talking on and on. This is very early on. And so he had taken guitar lessons and drum lessons when he was younger, but he stopped them. And so we brought the drumming and guitar instructor back in. And then eventually he found a local school of rock. He ended up enrolling in classes there, and it's performance based. So 1 year to the date after he came home from school shouting obscenities, he was literally performing on stage in a show. They did different bands, and the show he was performing in was Black Sabbath, which was not exactly my favorite, but it was right. But it was really funny because, well, he would practice constantly. He was so passionate about it. And then, of course, he went on to do Led Zeppelin, Tom Petty competitions. They performed in New York City and all over Connecticut and Westchester counties. So that was really something that helped Michael manage. And of course, one of the benefits of that was also that it builds so much self-esteem. And that was Michael's salvation. But for other kids, it could be sports, or it could be anything else that they're really interested in. Also, I think it's worth noting that intense focused activity, like playing music, leads people who tick into what I call sort of the no ticking zone. The soccer star and Olympian Tim Howard talks about when he's in the goal, he never ticked at all because he was always focused on saves.
Yeah, it's uncanny, but like when I am talking, I don't tick. I'll never like interrupt a sentence to tick. I'll just it's like I don't have it almost. And then I pause and I'm listening, and that's when my ticks come out. But once I'm producing some words, my ticks just disappear. Oftentimes, I mean, not only just can it make tics and symptoms better, there's confidence building there, and we also may find that we have some kind of an advantage in some of these areas. They may come easier to us. I'm curious, in Michael's case, with regard to music, was there anything that stood out like that, where the Tourette's or something about his nature led to some kind of advantage in music?
Well, it's interesting because as I said, he had taken drum lessons, he had taken guitar lessons, and literally he would just sit there and play the same chords to Smoke on the Water over and over, never really progressing. And then all of a sudden, he has this intense interest. And we didn't realize that he was musically talented until all of this went down. He was doing soccer. He played t-ball. He tried karate because he had the karate because he had behavioral problems. So we were trying to teach him some discipline. But so you're trying everything. And when he didn't pursue the music, we thought, well, why continue paying a drum instructor or a guitar instructor when he's not really that into it? But then once he did really get into it, as I said, through School of Rock, and he was playing drums, guitar, and he also sang, that's really when we realized that he was quite talented. And in fact, I have a former neighbor who was a music therapist who she jumped in and she told Michael that he has perfect pitch.
Really?
Who knew? And
Wow.
so things like that. But also, I did look into this somewhat in the book. Oliver Sacks wrote a whole book called Musicophilia about people and music's effect on the brain. It's fascinating. I only devote a few paragraphs to it, but there is no question that there's a connection there and that music can heal. It's really, really fascinating to me.
I'll give a shout out to another book I love. It's called This Is Your Brain on Music. Can't remember the author off the top of my head, but I had that one recommended to me and read it a few years ago. Fantastic. One of the things I love about your book is the emphasis on not the deficits of TS, but the benefits of it. Talk to me a little about some of the benefits of Tourette that you've seen or more generally in Tourette candidates.
Yeah, I feel like that's an idea that was introduced to me a while back, a local organization in Connecticut called Smart Kids with Learning Disabilities. People affiliated with that and parents used to talk a lot about the strengths. And I am still involved with them a bit, but I used to do some public relations work for them. But what I've found more and more in the last few years is that the Tourette community is also talking about this. And I just find it so interesting. People are sort of in the dark about what Tourette is and isn't. There's definitely still a stigma. This whole idea that not just people with Tourette's, but all sorts of neurodiverse people, yes, there are drawbacks, but there are also strengths. And like we just talked about music, but also other things. And I don't know if this falls into the same category, but years ago, Michael once said that having Tourette syndrome made him a better person. And I followed up with Michael specifically on this. And I said, what did you mean about that? And he said, I think I'm more empathetic and accepting. I appreciate different perspectives. And he said, because when you're struggling, you go through something like this where you're ostracized and even bullied, as he was at one point, you're not going to do it to anybody else. And he also said that it's kind of simplistic, but you're just nicer to people. And you realize that everyone has something going on that you don't know about. And I don't know if that's the benefits of neurodiversity in the workplace that I've read about. I'm not a medical expert at all, but I do think that that is a benefit. You can be a better human being, which is something.
Yeah, you can develop resilience and grit through it, and also that compassion. I found that as well. Being more open minded, I think, can be a nice outcome of that. I want to talk a little bit about Michael's schooling years, and you had mentioned the bullying and stuff happening. I'm not a parent, and I can only imagine how heartbreaking it is when you hear your kid they're being bullied. I'm curious to hear because there may be some lessons for other parents. How did you respond to that? Did you intervene? Did you not? Any tips there that that you learned or things you wish
I
you had done
did
differently?
intervene, and Michael was not thrilled about that.
Yeah,
So I
it's
think that
complicated.
it is
It's really
complicated.
delicate. Yeah.
By the time it happened, I think he was a freshman in high school. And it's not clear that he was bullied because of his Tourette, because by then it was under control. But nonetheless, that's one of the things that I didn't handle great because I really just wanted to stay on top of it. And he said that he didn't want me involved. And so he was in talks with the guidance counselor and other people involved in the school. Certainly, you need to take it seriously. Research has shown that kids with Tourette syndrome are more likely to experience bullying and also obviously a fair amount of teasing, taunts, and rejection from their peers, which is another reason why, finding your people is really important through these activities that you
Yep.
enjoy.
Yep.
Students with any kind of disability are also more likely to be bullied, of course. The Tourette Association did a survey, and the last one indicated that 70% of kids with Tourette said they had been bullied as a result of their condition. It goes on in the workplace. People who are neurodiverse are underemployed. It is a disability. So when you're talking about the workplace, people do need to be aware that they have protections. But that's not a quick fix, right?
Not a quick fix, but definitely use the tools you have. If you're a student, that means working with the guidance department, teachers. Did Michael disclose to his classmates ever or to the teachers?
He absolutely disclosed to teachers. Initially, he missed 3 months of school because he was shouting obscenities pretty much anytime he was awake. So when he did go back to school, there was a wonderful principal who really had his back, but he was reluctant to tell students. And in
Yeah.
fact, he wanted to come up with these cockamamie ideas like, can't I just say that I broke my leg or that I had mono?
Yeah.
So things like that. He didn't want to tell them what it was.
It's so hard, yeah, to talk to kids when you're a kid. Like they're talking to your peers, I think the peer pressure and everything, it's tough.
Remember, this was a while ago. I think it's different now. I mean, these kids now are struggling with so many mental health issues, anxiety, depression in teens and tweens it's rampant and it's horrible. And I think that kids are more apt to talk about that now than they were a decade ago. Anything related to something that makes you different. There's definitely been a push towards more inclusivity in general, I like to think. So I hope that kids are talking about it more. I tried to get him to become a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association. He didn't want to do that. I tried to get him to go to different activities with the local chapter, and he didn't want to do that. He sort of came around it in his own way and told people on his own time, which I can respect that because I don't have Tourette syndrome. I don't know what it's like. And it's been a long, long time since I was in middle school
Yeah.
or high school. So I had to respect all of those things.
It sounds like you took a nice balance there and giving him that space to disclose if needed, but in ways that he felt comfortable with.
I was a helicopter mom before he was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. And I talk about this in the book. A part of that was just that we bring a lot from our birth families, and my parents were real worrywarts. And I think I came into this parenting thing as a worrywart and also someone who really doubted my abilities as a mother. We didn't get a diagnosis till Michael was 11, and his early school years were a lot of trips to the principal's office when he was in like first grade or kindergarten. I can't remember which, but so I really, by the time he was diagnosed, I had kind of felt like I was not doing a great job as a mother. I used to say, wait till my perfect little daughter gets there to school,
Oh,
because then they'll realize that I am a decent mother. It was a lot. It was hard.
we raise our kids with the things that we think are going to be important based on our own challenges, struggles, insecurities, the things that we saw growing up. I would like to hear a little bit more about the things that when you think back on raising Michael, the things that maybe you would have done differently, knowing what you know now.
I felt like I had big shoes to fill. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, 4 kids. She really had a certain way about her. She passed in 2022, and the book is actually dedicated to her. So I did come into this with this idea, and there's a chapter early on titled "The Good Mother," and it's about my experiences growing up and what I thought about my job as a mother. In terms of mistakes, I mean, certainly one of them early on when Michael was misbehaving in preschool and kindergarten and so forth, before he was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, I always felt like I knew that something was off. And the mistake would be not trusting my gut because we were sent away over and over again. It's nothing. So certainly if I had gone to a Tourette expert early on, I do think he probably would have gotten diagnosed before he came home blurting out the curse words. And again, I would say I was too hard on myself overall. That's a mistake. Once he was diagnosed, then I put on basically my journalist hat and started delving into everything, reading medical studies, reaching out to the Tourette Association, local chapters for any information I could get. I went to lectures in person. I attended conferences. I was not patient at all. I was a mom in a hurry looking for a magic bullet. I remember thinking, okay, we have to fix this problem, which was certainly something that language that I would never use now. I will talk about this at the Tourette Association conference where I'm speaking as you are. One of the things I talk about is watch your language, because your kids absorb a lot of that. And Tourette syndrome is not a problem that has to be fixed. These kids are not broken. And that's sort of how I looked at it back then. That's something upsetting to me now, and something I would do differently.
Such an important point there around that. I've been using the term challenge instead of problem. I have Tourette, and it can pose challenges in my life. It also gives me a lot of the things that I'm most proud of in terms of who I am as a person. It's both. It's a mixed bag. It can be our superpower, and that doesn't mean it can also contribute to some bad days and some lousy experiences. But yeah, using the right terminology, especially with children that are going to pick up on that, super important for parents to be thinking about.
And these children do feel so different. It is a very distinct and unique diagnosis, right? I mean, so many kids have ADHD, kids on the spectrum. Those are things that you hear about, and the kids hear about, I think, more. But Tourette syndrome, they don't hear about it so much. And I don't necessarily think that it's because it's so rare. I think it's misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. But anyway, back to mistakes. One just little mistake is when Michael was first diagnosed, CBIT, cognitive behavioral intervention for tics, was experimental. And when it was offered to us, I declined. And Michael was also getting kind of impatient with all of the all the doctors that I had dragged him to. So I would say not giving that a try was probably a mistake. And then I said I was very hard on myself. This is hard to talk about, but I was pretty critical of my husband too. He is a doctor, an OBGYN. I wanted him to spend more time helping our son, helping me. And he was very focused on his job and his patients. We are still together, and I appreciate what my husband brought to the marriage more now. And I think writing gave me that perspective over the years. But also, spoiler alert for anyone who reads the book, I do think he does redeem himself throughout the book. But that's something I wish I had done differently.
When there are disagreements between parents on how to raise their kid, specifically with Tourette, but it could be more broad than that, how should those be handled?
Well, not the way I handled it. Let's put it that way. I was the one taking him to the doctor's appointments, and Michael was sharing so much. I mean, there's this bond that you create. I really felt like my opinion carried a little more weight in what we
Yeah.
did. And
Well, yeah, you were the one going to the doctor's appointments and then hearing
right,
him. He was confiding. I know, same thing I did with my mother. She was the one driving us to the appointments, like confided in her, would tell her things that, my dad just, we didn't talk about.
right. But there are different arguments that come up, and I'm very honest about this in the book, because I do think when there's a child who's challenged, it does put strain on the marriage. I've talked to a lot of other parents of kids with Tourette's and so forth. It puts a strain on your marriage. Figure out a way to get on the same page. And for us, we weren't arguing constantly, but there were some big picture things that we didn't agree on. And then there were times where I felt like my husband wasn't doing enough because he's a medical doctor. But as he pointed out, he's an OBGYN. He studied Tourette syndrome for 5 minutes in medical school, is the way he put it. So he wasn't exactly an expert, and he felt like our medical team was doing a lot and doing a great job. So one of the things that I did appreciate about him, and I talk about this, there's a scene in the book where I would get really flabbergasted dealing with the schools and the school administrators. And at one point we realized Michael really wasn't doing much work in middle school. And they called a team meeting, and all of his teachers, the guidance counselor, the school principal are all sitting there. there's an exchange with one of the teachers, and my husband just stood up to her. And I would have gotten so flabbergasted because this teacher, all she seemed to care about was she had 27 kids in the class, and Michael was pulling them down because he wasn't up to speed. And
Wow, that's a lot to put on one kid. That is a big wow.
so she wanted to sort of demote him down to the next lower class. But, we walked away from that meeting and I thought, wow, I may be doing all the work. I may be mad at you a lot, but I really appreciate that you were so calm, cool, and collected. And you stood up to this teacher and basically said, he can do the work. We've been helping him, and I've been helping him with math and science and so forth. And Michelle's been helping him with writing and reading and history, her subjects. And so people have to just sort of figure out a way to stay on the same page. And I write in the book that for us, what kept our relationship going was that we had a little happy hour every night, and we would sit down and the kids would be doing whatever they were doing, and my husband would come home from work and we would have a glass of wine or a drink together. And it was like a little mini date where before all hell broke loose, or which often happened at night, because that's sometimes when Michael would have meltdowns. There was that time where we could just talk amongst ourselves and not argue. I don't know if that's something
It's great. It's
this
a
is
great
this is
suggestion.
not medical advice, obviously, as I said, but this is what worked for us. And we did at one point went away for a weekend for my birthday, and we went on a trip to California. It was within a first year of when he was diagnosed. And my husband's aunt and uncle, God bless them, we stayed with them, and they begged us that they wanted to take care of the kids and let us go overnight to wine country for one night. And finally we acquiesced, and we went away for one night, and it was just like wonderful just to be the two of us. And that's really like a seminal part of the book too, because we realized that we had so many of the same goals and dreams for our kids that you lose sight of that when you're in a crisis. I mean, if families aren't, when this happens, it throws the family into a crisis, and it's hard to sort of see the forest for the trees and to realize how much that it affects family life. And it also affects siblings. I mean, there is no question that the so-called typical child is affected by having this family crisis too.
Yeah, and making sure that those children also feel that they're appreciated and valued and getting time with the parents and things like that, I think is crucial. And I love the way that you framed all of this regarding with your partner and making this as like a happy hour. This is a social, like this is for us to build our relationship. It's a date. It's adults should never stop dating, even after marriage. Like just keep building that relationship. You guys are a team. And I think remembering that, reinforcing that team, then just makes the two of you stronger and more prepared for whatever's going to come next.
Yeah, yes, I agree. And especially about supporting the siblings too, like you said, making sure that there's just time and listening and figuring out what it is they need, because their lives, my daughter was 2 years younger. Their lives don't stop. She still had to go to Girl Scout meetings and soccer practice and still wanted time with us.
There's cases where sometimes the child that doesn't have the diagnosis can feel neglected or like they're getting less attention, less time. Meet each person where they're at and with what they need and given the bandwidth of time you and your husband have. A lot of people I talk to that, especially if they're in rural communities, they're not in New Jersey and where they can just go to an NJCTS thing, or that maybe the TAA has a smaller presence in their area. A lot of parents of newly diagnosed patients will go on social media. They'll look at Facebook groups to find information about this. And it's been a good way for people to get some initial answers and at least find a community of people going through similar challenges. I'm curious to hear about your experience with that, with like specifically the Facebook pages around Tourette. Was that helpful for you? Was it not?
This was back in 2011 and 12. But I remember going into some forums, and they weren't on Facebook, but they were other forums. And I felt like there was initially, I did look into some complementary and alternative medicine routes. And I found like some of them had interesting information about things like diet and so forth, but some of them just sort of stoked my fears about things like we had done a renovation. Was there something in the insulation that did something? What I do now is try to, if I have anything helpful to say, I will post in there. It is a great way to have an online community. Also, the Tourette Association has different Facebook groups for different areas of the country. So I'm in the Connecticut one. You do have to be careful because Tourette syndrome manifests itself differently in everybody. There are the tics, which are what everybody sees, but then there are so many co-occurring conditions like OCD and ADHD and learning disabilities and anxiety. And so what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the next person with Tourette syndrome. Take it with a grain of salt if someone gives advice in a Facebook group about a particular medicine or something that did or didn't work for their child, because it's not necessarily going to work for yours. That said, I've been following a lot of different Tourette experts and the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and so forth, and the Tourette Association. And there are so many free webinars that local chapters hosts. Well, there's, of course, the Tourette Association's upcoming conference, TicCon 24. When I went to the Tourette Association conference in 2012, and I attended the newly diagnosed seminar with Dr. John Walkup, that was made available online afterwards. And he is doing that again this year. And it is incredible. It was so helpful. There's a whole chapter in the book on this and I call it Meeting Mr. Right, because I felt like everything was so valuable to me. And it was really chock full of information. Take advantage of that. If there are webinars, whether it's just learning about some of the medical aspects, or there's a lot of webinars on how to handle 504 plans and IEPs and things like that. Those can be very helpful. And I did consult Tourette Association education advocates early on who gave me free advice about all that.
Yeah, the NJCTS, New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome, also has a lot of free programming, like you had mentioned. There is a virtual support group for parents. It's led by Jeremy Lichtman, who I've had on the podcast, but he leads that group with parents. That's one of many free resources you can find through NJCTS and other groups to get some support. Also, if anyone is looking for therapists, this could be doctors, psychologists, counselors for CBID, medicinal therapy, alternative approaches. NJCTS is a great resource for that as well. We can send you our referred providers and connect you with someone in your area. And that's been a resource for a lot of people as well, including for some of the stuff you mentioned, like parenting. And we could recommend marriage therapists, couples counseling. Tourette, like you said, it affects the family. We put a lot of focus on the patient with it, but there's also support for those around them. And NJCTS and other groups can connect you to those for those interested.
No, they've been a great resource for me too. I've definitely used the NJTCS group as well. And one thing I'm trying to do on my own Instagram is just because I like blending my family story with facts. We've been doing something called Friday Facts, where we do just like little graphics about one little aspect of Tourette syndrome to educate people. So that's at Michele Turk author on Instagram. Like most parents, when your child is first diagnosed, you're just like a sponge, just trying to, absorb everything that you can learn about it, because it is overwhelming. But all of these are wonderful resources for parents. And this is a great resource for parents.
Thank you. And my, I think, kind of closing remark to parents would be to be forgiving of yourself and know that you're going to make mistakes, and that's just part of it. You want to be proactive and researching and finding these things. You also have to be your own person. As a parent, you're kind of running the family, and there's a lot that goes into that. You may have a job too, or you have other things, be kind, be understanding and forgiving of others and of ourselves, because any kind of challenge like this takes a lot from a lot of us. No one's going to do it perfectly. Wonderful. Well, it's been great having you on the podcast here, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you more at the TicCon later this month in Dallas. Would you share for our audience the title of your presentation at the conference?
Sure. The title of the presentation is If I Knew Then What I Know Now, 20 Lessons from Parenting a Child with Tourette Syndrome. And we've gone over some of those lessons today. And the book is called What Makes Him Tic, a Memoir of Parenting a Child with Tourette Syndrome. It's available wherever books are sold. It'll be out on June 4th. And I'm at micheleturk.com with one L and Michelle.
Wonderful. Glad to hear it. Thank you all for listening. Michelle, it's been great having you on the podcast. And to all of our listeners, hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening to The Uptick, brought to you by the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, empowering you to stretch the boundaries to live your best life. The NJ Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, NJCTS, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on this podcast. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any guest, nor do we advocate any treatment.